All right, so next we have Sophia Fifner. So Sophia is a philanthropy expert and advocate for women and girls. In her presentation, you'll hear her experiences with the media's impact on her journey to justice, how to be an unbiased ally of the anti-sexual violence movement, and why being an expert on sexual violence is different than other topics. Sophia, I wanted to pull up your bio here, so if you could please say a little bit more about yourself when you get up here, I would love for them to hear that. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. For those who are online, thank you so much for joining this conversation online. I only had the opportunity to listen to the tail end of Rachel's presentation, but oh my gosh, Rachel, I mean, just the 10 minutes that I had the opportunity to listen to what you're saying, how you're talking about reporting, it was so validating. So thank you so much for leading the training prior to me, and then also the training afterwards. To tell you a little bit about myself, actually, I have a slide about that, so perfect.
Great.
I don't have to tell you all the things I'm going to tell you. But before I start that, just an overview of what we're going to be sharing today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'll share a little bit about my story, and then hopefully I'll leave you with an opportunity to just know how you can better report and support survivors through an anti-oppression lens, anti-sexual violence, etc. And then if we have an opportunity to answer any questions, whether it be online or here in the room, happy to answer any questions. I truly am. I try to be as open of a book as possible. All right, next slide. So this is me. I'm a mom of two young girls. They're 2 and 5. That photo is from last year. I'm really passionate about politics and women's rights. I probably spend all of my free time, even time that I do not technically have, doing anything I can possibly do to help women and girls. I started my career on Capitol Hill. I supported press for Senator Voinovich at the time. He retired. I spent the last 15 plus years working in either corporate philanthropy or fundraising or nonprofits. I would say the best job that I ever had was working for Recreation and Parks for the city of Columbus, because I literally got to be the living embodiment of Leslie Knope every single day. It was freaking awesome. And I love every single quote by Leslie Knope. Additionally, it's how Recreation and Parks is perceived online or on the TV show is very accurate. Just multiply that by 400 parks and 100 different facilities and a violence intervention program and all the other things. I am, as a kid, I feel like I was a pretty typical kid. I grew up in Pickerington, Ohio. I need to compare my photo with my daughter. She just took her kindergarten photo. This is my kindergarten photo. I probably do a side by side. But aside from that, I think that I would describe myself as a typical millennial. It's very inspired by Clueless. I think it's a great movie. I love Dolly Parton. I love Lucky Charms. You can't see a theme here of bright pink and rainbows and happiness. I would definitely say that would be a huge core of my identity. But before I tell you a little bit more about myself, my journey, I like to know who's in the room. So for those online, if you could share with me your favorite food or a fun fact, similar to my favorite band, etc. And then for those in the room, I am curious to know just, where are you from and if you have a favorite anything.
Hi, I'm Laura Wilson. I'm a student photojournalist, and my favorite food is sweet potatoes.
Ooh, yum.
Yeah.
Now, do you eat them plain or do you do like lots of toppings?
Sometimes I just do butter, but sometimes I do like pumpkin pie seasoning.
Ooh, I haven't tried that. I will try that. It's okay. Good to know.
I'm a senior studying journalism at OU. One of my favorite bands. Currently, it's The Used. Also Rise Against. I don't know if anyone knows those bands, but they're like punk rock, and that's just been my vibe lately.
Love it. I've been listening to Fletcher a lot. I don't know if anybody listens. Oh my gosh, I'm like obsessed. Like I'm so obsessed. I wish I could go to one of her concerts. I'm going to add that to my list. All right. Anybody else want to share a little bit about themselves?
Sure. I'm Lori. I'm with the Alliance. I have seen Fletcher live. Amazing. really random fact, if I can eat it in a bowl, I prefer it that way.
Oh.
Bowls are just the cozy utensil.
I can appreciate that. Yeah.
I'll go next. My name is Caroline Anderson. I'm the communications coordinator for the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. So OADSV's the statewide coalition against sexual violence. I'm with the statewide coalition against domestic violence. We work closely. My favorite vacation spot is Destin, Florida. It's right there on the Panhandle, Emerald Water.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jen Ida Miller. They, them, she, her pronouns. I'm with the Ohio Alliance. And my favorite drink these days is a brown butter maple latte they have down at Triple Coffee, and it has like sage in it. It's a great fall time treat if anyone wants to.
Noted. That sounds delicious, and I definitely need that in my life. Did we get any responses online? I know that sometimes Zoom engagement can be, oh yay.
Yeah, we did. So Abigail Preisig, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Abigail, student journalist at Cleveland State. I also love Dolly Parton, and I am also a bold girl. My favorite musical artist right now is Steve Lacy.
Yay,
Yeah.
love the Dolly fans. I mean, how can you not love Dolly? I mean, the hair, the costumes, the songs, the intelligence, all the things. Just, she's amazing. All right, well, next slide, please. I realize that, well, being in a training like this is not an easy place to be in for, several hours. So I'm going to apologize in advance. But my story and the experience that I have is really heavy. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a small town. I grew up in Pickerington, Ohio in the 1980s. And for anyone who knew most suburbs around central Ohio during that time period, there was nothing there, literally. I mean, my parents are immigrants from Jamaica, and they immigrated to the South Bronx in the late 70s. And if you know anything about the South Bronx in the late 70s, it was a really tough environment. They found their way to Pickerington, Ohio for a job opportunity. And in Pickerington, we had a Dairy Queen and a drive-through beverage facility, a gas station, and a grocery store. And that was pretty much it. But my childhood overall was normal, for whatever that means. I played outside a lot. I spent a lot of time looking for crawdads. Most of my friends, which I think is really interesting, their families are from Kentucky and West Virginia, which is why I think I have this affinity for like Dolly Parton, that, and I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music except for country. So I like country artists. I grew up in a very conservative household. We went to church 2 times, sometimes 3 times a week. So if you needed somebody to answer any Bible Bowl question, I would be your girl. Exceptional at that. But aside from that, my childhood was normal. Played Monopoly, went to the pool. I participated in dance and cheerleading as a student at Pickerington, and I never felt unsafe. And one night in November, actually, it was a balmy November night, unlike today, where it's nice and sunny outside. I had a friend who asked me would I like to go to a party, and I said, sure, why not? I've been to parties before because there's nothing to do in Pickerington, nothing. And I didn't think that this one would be any different than the other parties that I went to. I didn't know anybody at the party. She said it was a friend of a friend. I trusted her. So I said, sure. I remember that the air smelled cool and kind of like wet mud. To this, like for those who grew up in Ohio, I feel like that's like there's a very fall, like, the smell of decaying leaves,
Yes.
right before winter is about to happen. And I remember walking into this home, and it was a split level home with white siding and black shutters in Gahanna, Ohio. Nothing that would stand out outside of the ordinary. I walked in, there was about 15 or so individuals there that I did not know. They were older. There's lots of alcohol on the table. And I grew up in a household where I'm pretty confident that my parents still have the same bottle of rum from when I was a child. I mean, we only used it if we were baking banana bread, and at much, maybe a capful, but nothing more. So I knew that there was alcohol on the table. I just didn't know what it was because I didn't grow up in an environment where that was something that was the norm. But I proceeded to sit down around this coffee table with a group of guys and girls and decided to chat and drank a lot of alcohol. Specifically Smirnoff. That was the beverage of choice at high school parties in the early 2000s, at least in Pickerington. And I drank a lot that night, so much so that I got really tired. I wanted to leave and go to sleep, but my friends weren't ready yet. So I knew that there was a bed in the basement area. And I went down there, found it. It was a dark basement, you know, cement walls, cinder block walls. And I would say that I fell asleep. I technically passed out. And I did not wake up until I felt someone inside me. And I wish that at the time that it would have been something where I would have like come to with superpower strength and would have screamed and would have pushed their body away from mine and shouted no. But I couldn't move. Like I couldn't move. And I don't know, I hope, well, statistically, more likely than not, I have another person in this room who has shared a similar experience like mine. But it felt like my life had left me. Like I could feel what was happening. I could see it from above, but I couldn't do anything about it. And he finished and I ran upstairs. And I proceeded to tell the small group of friends that I arrived with what happened. And they asked me, are you sure that's what happened? Are you sure that this person assaulted you? And I told them what happened. They didn't believe me. So I stayed in the home overnight until I could get a ride home. And instead of going home, I actually was dropped off at another friend's house. And I don't know how at 17, she had the wisdom to help me, but she told me that what happened to me was that I was raped and that I needed to go to the hospital immediately. So she drove me to Mount Carmel Hospital here in Central Ohio, where they completed a SANE kit. And the nurses validated, yep, we've found sperm inside you. We're going to give you this medication. We're going to go through this procedures. A detective group came in, asked me to repeat my story. I shared again what happened to me. Meanwhile, I was mortified. I was mortified because I grew up in a household where drinking was perceived as a negative activity. I grew up in a household where we didn't talk about sex. I didn't know what happened to me because I didn't have the words to describe what happened to me. I didn't know that that was sexual assault. I did not know that that was rape. I heard that word before, used in a very glamorized perspective, on like a Lifetime movie, but in movies, it's oftentimes glamorized as this stranger that comes out like from the garbage can and attacks you and kidnaps you. That wasn't my experience. So I just didn't put two and two together. And I was terrified because even at 17, I knew very well that if my own friends questioned me and didn't believe me, if I had to repeat my story multiple times, these people who were trying to help me, I was apprehensive about what next steps I could take. I read all of the pamphlets that they gave me, and I read that more likely than not, if you're going to be attacked or if you're going to be raped, it's oftentimes somebody that you know, it's somebody of the same race as you. And this individual was a stranger and was somebody of the opposite race of me. He was a Caucasian male. And so I was nervous about doing anything because as a Black woman who grew up in a very rural community that was not incredibly diverse, was very well aware of the narrative that might be perceived if I am telling this truth. Regardless, the detectives contacted my parents and they asked if I would be interested in taking a polygraph test. They suggested that, my rapist do the same. However, his family, he grew up they told my parents this, he lives in a nice neighborhood and his attorneys have advised him not to. And while my parents are, I think, just like a lot of American families who are immigrants or American families who work really, really hard, most families don't know what steps they can take to obtain an attorney. I mean, my parents followed or law-abiding newly citizens of the United States. The last thing they wanted to do is find an attorney, and they didn't even know you could get attorneys for individuals like myself or their daughter. And if the detective said, hey, we're suggesting this polygraph test, we wanted to comply. So my parents drove me to Franklin County Children's Services. And I'll never forget, because this building looks like the quintessential government building. I remember walking in, it's that steely blue color that a lot of government offices are, with a lot of metal cabinets. I walked through, there was a glass room that was open windows. You walk through, there was another set of glass. I remember the polygraph machine to my left and a small chair, and the sheriff. She was a taller blonde woman, and she had me sit down in the chair and she stood above me and she proceeded to ask me again what happened. So I told her what happened. And she told me that I've woken up to many men in college and I was not sexually assaulted. And what you're telling me is a lie. And we are not going to proceed with this polygraph test until you rewrite your statement. And I thought about my options at that time as a 17-year-old. And I decided that I wasn't going to rewrite my statement because it wouldn't be true. And when Rachel mentioned that oftentimes or frequently she's heard from survivors that it wasn't the actual rape that was the worst experience, in my case, this is also true. I wish I could say that my actual rape was the worst experience of my life, but the worst experience of my life was not being believed. I told my story. I told my friends, I told the authority figures in my life what happened to me. And at every single moment that I tried to seek and find justice, I was told that I was lying, that I was a liar. So I remember walking out of the facility and the trooper saying, I'm going to tell your parents that you're lying. It's like, and again, I was not a kid who tried to intentionally poke the bear and not follow rules. I had a great relationship with our DARE officer, surprisingly, and I got good grades. I followed rules generally. I made one mistake, but that mistake shouldn't be held against me for a violent crime. And I wish I could say that, all right, well, this sheriff who chose not to believe me was the end of my case, but it wasn't. As Rachel shared earlier, the story continues. And I would say that the 15 years of my trauma that I experienced, not being able to manage it, not knowing what resources to go to, because quite frankly, I worried every single time I told my story, would somebody believe me? But I remember attending college and having panic attacks when I was around groups of men, or having panic attacks at the smell of alcohol, or having uncontrollable flashbacks at work conferences, the most inconvenient times, or during some of the most intimate moments with my husband, having a flashback and having that trigger an entire spiral of anxiety and depression. And, over 15 years, I probably saw 7 different therapists trying to work through the trauma that I experienced and the lack of justice that I felt I received when reporting my crime. And throughout 15 years, there are so many times where I called the police department, which originally took my report, to find out what else could I do. At one point, the woman told me that well, you're beyond your statute of limitations, which was just the wrong information. I just didn't know where to look. I didn't know that there was an organization like the Ohio Alliance in Sexual Violence. I didn't realize that there was an organization like the Ohio Crime Victims Justice Center. I just didn't have a clue where to find the level of support that I needed. And it wasn't until I had, actually, I'll take one step back. I got to a point in my story where I realized that I wanted to do a little bit more. I wanted to support individuals who were survivors of sexual assault. And I had spent honestly the last 6 years prior to advocating for other individuals for various causes, whether it be self-esteem or financial literacy through the Miss America Scholarship Program, like in pageants. And I won't derail the conversation, but pageantry taught me how to find my voice and how to advocate for others. Some people participate in pageants for all sorts of reasons, but for me, it really gave me confidence to be able to articulate why something matters on a stage with county commissioners, with nonprofit organizations. It really challenged me to understand, how do you raise funds? How do you support legislation? And I got to a point as an adult, well after my pageant years, I wanted to be more involved in this process. So I actually had a reporter reach out to me, and I'm sharing this primarily because of Rachel's presentation, but the reporter asked me, well, where is your report? And I was like, okay, well, I tried this. They told me this is all they had. So I sent him the information that I had, and he's like, well, where's the BCI report? Like, where's everything else? I was like, well, they said that this is all they had. Well, we did a little bit more digging, and what we found out was that my rape kit was destroyed. And I'm so thankful to him, because I wouldn't have asked additional questions was it not for his reporting and his ability to share the information that he was receiving and verifying that with me. I would have no idea that it was destroyed. I would have no idea that this individual that I had reached out to at the police department wasn't providing me all of the information. That was really disheartening. And I'm going to fast forward, but everyone says that when you have children, it changes you. And as somebody prior to who did not have children, was like, okay, sure, it changes you. Yeah, okay. But for me, at least, it really did. I brought my daughter into this world with my husband a few days after the 2016 election cycle. And that was a really important election for me as a daughter of immigrants, as a survivor of sexual assault, as someone who's incredibly passionate about gender equity. And I made a promise to my daughter that I was going to use my voice and for me, a meaningful way, which means doing more advocacy work for survivors of sexual assault, doing more advocacy work for Black women specifically. And that promise has taken me on a journey where I was able to put together the timeline of what actually happened to my story. Unfortunately, I feel like at every single opportunity where it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to get more information, and I find out that information is devastating. The state trooper who did not enter the polygraph test put in a file that said I admitted that the sex was consensual, despite my rapist saying that he never touched me. And that I fabricated and submitted a false report. And, it was frustrating because I knew that I could certainly pursue a case, but it'd be incredibly challenging to do so with no rape kit, with a file that's just littered with inaccuracies. I mean, there were, I reread my report recently, and the detective put in his report, oddly, she decided to stay the night at this home where she was reportedly raped. And I was like, geez, wow, oddly, I stayed the night there. If he had been to one of these trainings or really participated in any OAESB events, he probably would have had a very different perspective on how he's reporting what happened that night. But his words and his language that he was choosing, he was making a lot of assumptions, right? When the reporter called my family and said, well, he lives in a nice neighborhood and he has an attorney, and their attorney suggested that he not take these steps. They're making a lot of assumptions. about the entire process. So long story short, it's the journey to justice for me looks differently. And I think if I leave this group with anything, which I will touch on in a few slides later, but if I leave you with anything, it's to know that every survivor story is a little bit different. My justice is using my voice because I could not seek justice through traditional means. So every time I have the opportunity to share what happened to me, I hope that I can help individuals who are working or connecting with survivors. So with that, I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide. Oh, this is baby Caroline. I mean, every mom thinks that their kid is the cutest, but I mean, but I love this quote by Martin Luther King Jr. that our lives begin to end the day that we become silent about things that matter. I feel very strongly about this. You know, I was assaulted in 2003, and I wish I could say that I'm totally fine. I have no symptoms of trauma, and I go about my life every single day just making presentations like this. But I can tell you that 2 weekends ago, I had a terrible panic attack. I mean, a crippling panic attack. Like so much so that I'm like, okay, well, I guess this is like phase 19 of my journey towards healing. But this process does not end, and I so wish that it did. All right, brass tacks. So how to be an unbiased ally. So I know that you've listened to quite a few presentations, so I will try to not take up too much time with the meat and potatoes, because I feel like you're probably going to cover this and or have already covered this, but just some data about sexual violence. If you want to move the next slide, please. So I always feel like people are always like bewildered by some of the statistics around sexual violence, but I'm repeating them because I think it's really important that we not forget them. But one, that sexual violence happens constantly. I mean, I feel that sexual violence is a public health crisis that needs to be addressed and no one is talking about. And the rippling effect of that sexual violence has on our community is overwhelmingly outstanding. But also the statistic that I like to share a lot, because I think oftentimes people think, oh, one, that most women or individuals who are the victims of sexual assault that they actually report, which that's not true. But then even if you do report, only 25 out of 1,000, and 25 is a high estimate. I've seen estimates much lower. Only 25 rapists actually spend time in jail. So when I meet other survivors who are going through their journey towards justice and healing, I like to talk about all of the ways that they can seek justice, because going through our legal system has a lot of hurdles, more hurdles than I think most people could fathom or understand. All right, next slide. So allyship. So essentially allyship is if you're an individual from one entity or group, that you're supporting individuals from another group with some level of compassion, love, and intention. And I added compassion, love, and intention because when I was looking for definitions of allyship, I felt that they were incredibly sterile. And as an individual who represents several marginalized groups, I think that the thing that has been most helpful to me when working with individuals who are not from the same group is that they're asking questions or they're showing support with some level of compassion, love, and intention. The intentionality is so important, especially in today's climate where I feel like people can be incredibly passive to understanding other individuals' stories and voices and experiences. So how do you be an ally? So you probably have heard this already, but do your homework. And I say that in the gentlest way. I know that I've been in some trainings for diversity, equity, inclusion, and I've heard from DEI practitioners who are like, if you don't do your homework, don't even come at me, which I understand and I respect, I get it, but I also realize that some people are just not quite there yet. And from my perspective, I would rather you try to do what you can and ask questions than to be intimidated to not even ask questions at all. Because I think that those questions are how we can have really important conversations and how we can move the needle forward. Your needs are secondary. So as a reporter, I think that this is important because when working with survivors of sexual assault, it's easy to especially interact with them. You know, you're on a deadline. You have to get a report in or a story. You have to edit the story, etc. But sharing their story or pieces of their trauma is hard. It's taxing. And I think that when you're reporting stories, especially with survivors, that your needs need to become secondary to that survivor's as much as possible. And acknowledge your privilege and power. We all come from different spaces and have different life perspectives. And I think that we should really acknowledge that. Now, I say that even as a Black woman speaking to you today, like if I was interviewing an individual who's a survivor, I realized that even as a Black woman, there are privileges that I have that other people might not have. I have a master's degree. I live in a very comfortable house. I'm not worried about stocking my refrigerator, right? And if I'm speaking to an individual where they have all sorts of other environmental pressures that they're concerned about, I need to be thoughtful about that and acknowledge that, right? So next slide, anti-sexual violence. I think that this is pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to put this in here just in case anybody was confused, quite frankly, but you're here, so hopefully you're not confused. But essentially, just in summary, I won't read you this definition, but don't be unkind and don't hurt people with sexual violence. And work actively to prevent that. So some practical tips for how you can do this. One, from a reporter lens, using thoughtful images. I think that the story about the photo in front of Taco Bell was great. And again, everything you said was so validating. I was like, yes, absolutely. And I'm saying you, for those online, I'm pointing to Rachel, who was just presenting. But use thoughtful images and language when you're reporting stories of sexual violence. And I think that also, it's not just making sure that you're reporting things accurately, but also taking into all of the layers of identities that individual might be representing. So whether it be their correct pronouns or if they're from a diverse ethnic community, just being really thoughtful and intentional about all of those nuances. Are you the right person to share this story? And I think that's a really important question that I included because it's not just, are you the right person to share, i.e., are you an individual who actively promotes sexual violence, which I hope none of you are, but also, are you also a survivor as well? And is that going to frame, I hope that's not, I'm not using that in a bad way from a journalistic standpoint, but is that going to frame the narrative in a way that's not helpful to helping that survivor show up authentically? And have you done your homework? Again, I can't stress the importance of really thinking about all of the nuances to a survivor's story. The story that you shared about domestic violence and the layers of trauma that an individual can experience, whether it be through generations or racial trauma, etc., is so true. With my story, for example, there's so many layers and complications to my story. My parents are immigrants. Our perception of police in the United States, it might be very different than I'm married into a family who is Caucasian. They've been in the United States for a very long time. So it'd be very different from my mother-in-law's perception of working and interacting with the police. The nuances of facts and details to sexual violence stories, there's so many individuals that are touched by one experience or exposure to trauma. So understanding the laws, the nuances to the laws, the individuals who are influencing those laws, all of those, the language, the words, all of it matters. I want to be thoughtful to time. So I'm going to skip this question because I'd love to be able to answer some questions. If you want to skip 2 more slides, I'll cover the data points. The previous slide, it just shared the impact of sexual violence. I mentioned that I feel that sexual violence is a public health crisis. And I say that because the personal impact to survivors, I just shared that I have all of the resources in the world. I really do. I have one, I'm highly educated. I'm married into a family of attorneys, specifically plaintiffs' attorneys who represent injured and harmed individuals. I have access to, through my job, a network of individuals who can open doors for me, but yet my trauma persists and impacts me in really intimate and personal ways every single day. There is not a day that goes by that I do not think about the day that I was raped. Every single day. It's been nearly 20 years. And that impacts how I make decisions for my family. And I shared the previous information about my life because I feel very privileged to be able to even have those resources to access 7 therapists over 20 years, to be able to pay for or pick up the phone and say, hey, county prosecutor, how does this process work? Most survivors do not have that access and do not have that privilege. And I can't imagine what it would be like to try to heal when you don't have that level of access or support. But the economic impact of survival, like of sexual violence, $3.1 trillion. So when I say that this is a public health crisis, I think about the cost to society for individuals who are committing violent crimes and not having the resources and support structures in place to make sure that this doesn't happen. But this slide's important because I think that sometimes when people approach this type of violence, they might perceive it as, oh, this is a linear thing that happens. Person is harmed. Harmed person reports crime. People believe them. They go to court. Rapist goes in jail. They're totally fine. That's not the case for most survivors. And I like this because there's so many complications and paths and avenues that an individual's personal journey can go, as well as if they choose to pursue any legal path. It's the same complicated web that they have to figure out as a victim of a violent crime. So my question to this group is, and just out of curiosity, but like, what responsibility do you feel reporters have when sharing stories of sexual violence? I'm asking the folks online, as well as the folks in this room. Nobody knew I was going to make you talk.
I haven't asked this yet today.
Yes.
I feel like it in a different, I don't want to say the same aspect, obviously, because the reporter and the victim are obviously in 2 different situations, but in the same sense that the victim is like, if I don't share my story, then it could happen to another person. Like the reporter is simultaneously like, if I don't report on it, then the likelihood of it happening again is higher than maybe if I were to report on it.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. Any other thoughts? All right, I'm going to continue because I want to make sure I can share all the information I want to share. That's a really great point. You know, as a survivor, I honestly felt that I was alone. Again, validating what Rachel was sharing. I really thought I was alone. You see the statistics and the details around like who's impacted by sexual violence. I thought I must be the only person that I know. And I know a lot of people. And I felt this way, not just when I was 17, but also when I was 21 and at Miami University. And when I was 22 working in Washington, DC. And when I was 29, you know, getting married, like I felt alone for a very long time. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch on just race and gender and how that impacts sexual violence, because I also think that's really important. As reporters, you know, as somebody who identifies as female, I think that oftentimes when we talk about sexual violence, our stories are shared. But another aspect that I think is really important, and that perhaps this is a nuance that people don't pay enough attention to, is the representation of trans individuals and their journeys and their stories as survivors of sexual assault. Additionally, the stories of men I feel like their voices are oftentimes not heard in this conversation, and their experiences are just as valid as mine. And then race and ethnicity, Black women, or 1 in 5 Black women will be the victim of rape in her lifetime. That's a lot. And when I say, I don't want to lose sight of, even knowing the statistic, knowing how many Black women I know, I still felt alone. And so your responsibility as reporters in sharing this story, I think it's more than just sharing the story. You're helping other individuals realize that perhaps they're not alone. There might be a clue or a detail in what you're sharing that makes another individual go, geez, I might not be the only person who's experienced this type of assault. So trauma-informed reporting. I want to skip 2 slides. So when you're reporting and working with survivors of sexual assault, thank them for telling their story. It's really hard. And, I'm here with no tears telling my story, and it's not an easy thing for me to do. So sharing thanks, I think, is just a first step of being gracious, being patient. I know that I've worked with reporters before, and there are moments where, it's just hard to use with tears, and it's totally okay to say, hey, do you need a moment? Would you like a Kleenex? Do we need to come back and revisit this at another time? That's totally fine. But your patience is much appreciated. And this actually happened to me 2 weeks ago, Waterworks, right? So I appreciate the patience. I'm not being judgmental. And this is something that I'm still working through. I sit on the board of the Women's Central Ohio, which is an organization that supports gender equity. I've had plenty of therapy to not blame my decisions from that night for why I was sexually assaulted. But I still feel like I'm being judged every single time I share that there was alcohol involved in my assault. And when you're having a conversation with somebody who is a survivor of sexual assault, approaching it from a non-judgmental lens is really important, because at least for myself, I can't speak for all survivors, clearly, I feel judged always, and acknowledging their pain. I think that this suggestion is really important because, I mentioned I felt alone, and many survivors do. And the acknowledgement that what happened was wrong and okay has been really helpful for me. It also does help survivors as well. Next slide. So anti-oppression, we seek to recognize the oppression that exists in our society, and we're attempting to mitigate the effects of it. So if you are trying to practice anti-oppression while reporting a story connected to sexual violence, really challenge yourself to think about how can you courageously show up in an honest way to make yourself vulnerable, and realize, again, we all wear identities, either by choice or by nature, and to just acknowledge that and realize, all right, if I'm telling this story, how can I do the least amount of harm? And how can I recognize the influence that I have when having a conversation with a survivor of sexual assault? And then the last section is building relationships. So if you want to skip to the slide that says individuals, nonprofits, and government. So every survivor story is different. I shared my story, but I assure you, there are probably a lot of people who have a similar experience to me, but there's a lot of people who have a completely different experience with either reporting or healing from their experience. And approaching each story as a unique thumbprint is really critical. But also to think about all the individuals who intersect with survivors. Oftentimes, reporters want to ask the first source of, all right, I'm going to interview the survivor or perhaps their family, but there are so many individuals who can also get their perspective from, which includes the nonprofit organizations that work with survivors of sexual assault, depending on what's going on in that community, you could reach out to nonprofits that also work with that survivor, whether it be an organization that focuses on social justice, it could be a food pantry. From a government perspective, there's so many layers of government, from local government all the way up to federal government, that might have some voice or perspective on your story. It could be really critical to telling the scope of what's going on. For example, if you're reporting on the impact of Aaron's Law, it would be really critical that you also include reaching out to the General Assembly and representatives from the General Assembly versus just the survivor alone. So, in summary, practice trauma-informed reporting, and just remember that every survivor's experience is thumbprint and diverse, and the complexity is incredibly deep. I'll end with this before I answer any questions. Is one of my favorite, I'm so inspired by, there's a lot of people I'm inspired. I have a whole list of like people that I'm inspired by. Is that a weird thing? I have a lot of weird words. But I love Rosa Parks because I think that people, well, it's when I learned about her, which I feel like my history books ended in like 1959. I learned about Rosa Parks. The perception of her was that she was only a civil rights activist who was specifically focused on race. But she was so much more. Like she was, I want to be Rosa Parks when I grow up. Like that's my life goal. Yeah, and Polly Murray. I want to be Polly Murray and Rosa Parks.
And Don Horton.
Yes, yeah, all the people. So, but she wrote that memories of lives, our work, and our deeds will continue in others. And as individuals who work in a space that tells stories, actual stories, I think that your work is really critical because it is the living, breathing way that some of those memories continue. So thank you so much for the work that you do and your dedication to supporting survivors. Thank you for the folks online. I haven't forgotten about you, which is why I'm going to open up the floor for a few minutes, maybe for any questions that people might have. If you want to go to I think that's the last slide. Yeah. Oh, find me online. Yeah. I'm happy to be friends with people. I'm on TikTok. That's where the fun is. But I'm also on Instagram and all the other places.
I didn't know you were on TikTok.
Yeah. Right. Oh, I'm obsessed. It's amazing.
TikTok.
Where have I been?
Any questions? I take questions. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, that's totally fine. You know where to find me.
Yeah.
I'm very accessible. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to share my voice and my story.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.